Hello, I'm Robin Dennison. I'm going to be talking to you today about instructional design. And this is just one of my favorite topics. This is Module 4 of 628. First of all, let's review the objectives for this particular module, because pretty much all of the content within this module will be focused on to some degree in this particular webcast. So first of all, we're going to talk about what instructional design is, and I have a couple great definitions I really like for that. We're going to talk about some models of instructional design. Probably the one that you're going to hear most about is called the ADDIE model, but we're going to talk about a few others. Develop an instructional design table for a presentation and or a course, and you're going to be doing that for your presentations with your peers in your live seminars, as well as your final assignment for this particular course. Also, you're going to be practicing on composing behavioral objectives that are both measurable and achievable. And then we're going to categorize objectives as either cognitive, affective, or psychomotor. And then you're going to order verbs in Bloom's taxonomy from lowest to highest in terms of cognitive ability. And then we'll also be talking about selecting teaching and learning methods, strategies, as well as evaluation methods according to the objective. So those should match. Both your teaching and learning strategy should match your objective, as well as the evaluation method should match the objective. So first of all, what is instructional design? And even though you may not have ever really used that term, you know what instructional design is, and you've been involved in this to some degree, I'm sure. This particular definition came from a book by Horton on e-learning, but I really like this definition. So forgive me for reading it to you because I just want to read it again because I like it. Design is decision. Development is doing. So when we talk about course development, that's different from course design. And then design governs what we do, whereas development governs how we carry out those decisions. And design involves a lot of judgment, compromise, trade-off, and really a tremendous amount of creativity. Design is the 100 or 1001 decisions, big and small, that affect the outcome. And that is, of course, the learning outcomes with our students, our learners. This is another component of that, and that is, again, from the same author. Instructional design requires selecting, organizing, and specifying the learning experiences necessary to teach somebody something. So those are just two definitions of instructional design, and I really like them both. And they're actually from the same book. So what is the process for instructional design? First and foremost, you have to really think about what the goal of your particular either class or course is. What do you want people to be able to come away from that particular class course? And then you set your learning objectives, and we'll talk about those and making them measurable. And then you decide on the teaching sequence of your objectives. You know, one of the things that I find is so true in curriculum design is that you want everything to be first. It's like, well, they need this course before this course, and they need this course before this course. And it's like everything can't be first. And the same is true when you're designing a class or a course. You have to decide simple to complex, what is the sequence of the content that you're going to be presenting in this particular course. You're going to decide on the learning assessments. Again, that's evaluation. Many times we use the word assessment, evaluation interchangeably. And then finally, the learning activities that will get them to be successful on those learning assessments, evaluations. Now, you might notice in this particular list that the evaluations come before the selection of the learning activities. And you can decide for yourself what seems to fit you best in terms of the flow and the way that you design classes or courses. This particular diagram is looking at Theory of Instruction by Gagne. And as you look at this particular illustration. I really like this one, even though there's a major typo in terms of taxonomy. I kept trying to fix it, but because this is, again, a pickup, I couldn't get that fixed. So it is taxonomy, not taxonomy. So the three components of taxonomy of learning outcomes, of course, those are your three components of Bloom's, right? And that is psychomotor and affective and cognitive domains. And then conditions of learning. And you had a lot of that last nurse educator course in your theories of learning. And then also he identifies 9 events of instruction. And we'll be talking about this a little bit later. And that is gaining attention, informing learners of the objectives, stimulated recall of prior learning so that we get people to build on what they already know, presenting the stimulus, providing guidance through the learning process, eliciting performance from our learners, providing feedback throughout the process to our learners, assessing the performance throughout and at the end. And we'll talk about both what we call formative evaluation as well as summative evaluation. And then finally, also enhancing retention and transfer. And that is being able to retain that new knowledge and apply it to, in many cases, certainly for us, to the work environment. Probably the most famous, for lack of a better term, or the instructional design model that you'll hear the most about is called ADDIE. And the ADDIE model, the components are analyze, design, develop, implement, and evaluate. It's interesting, there are some people who argue that this isn't really an instructional design model because it has the word design in the model, and it's supposed to be about designing. So some people have some trouble with that, but you'll see how that really works as we go through the components of ADDIE. Now, next course, NEP3, so to speak, we'll be talking about online instruction. And online instruction, the instructional design model is a little bit different because in essence, develop and implement are together as a stage called build when we talk about course builds online, and you'll be getting more about that in your third nurse educator course. So these are the components of ADDIE. And by the way, you'll notice that a lot of these illustrations are pickups from the web. And if you want more information about them, then I always give you the website where they came from, and you can always click on that and go and read more about it on that particular website. So these are the components of ADDIE with a description of the steps. So again, analysis, we're going to be talking more about that, design, development, implementation, evaluation. So this is just a summary. So let's talk about it a little bit more in depth. The first step is analysis. And during the analysis stage, the designer, that's going to be you, identifies the learning problem, the goals and objectives, what the audience of learners really needs, what existing knowledge those learners already have, and anything else relevant. It also considers the learning environment, like for instance, particularly your learning strategy may be greatly dependent upon your setting. Can you really put these chairs in the auditorium in a circle? Not. So certainly where your class is going to be held has an influence on your teaching learning strategies. Any constraints, delivery options, and certainly the timeline for the project. Questions to answer. These are just a few questions that are helpful when you think about the analysis stage. Who are the learners? For many of you, your learners are going to be undergraduate students or graduate students. For a lot of the rest of you, your learners are actually going to be new graduates or even experienced nurses who are coming to continuing education programs, for instance, to advance their learning. What are the characteristics of these learners? And so you really want to ask, well, if you're talking about undergraduates, have they had patho yet, right? Have they had pharmacology yet? What courses have they already had in the curriculum? If you're talking about a continuing education program, what specialty nurses are going to be here? What do they already know about this particular topic? What is a desired new behavioral outcome? What types of restraints do we have? What are the delivery options? And then certainly, what are the pedagogical considerations and the timeline again? So those are questions to be answered during this analysis stage. In the design stage, this is really a systematic process to identify your learning objectives and how you're going to plan to deliver the content and stimulate the learning. Sometimes storyboards are used. You may be working with graphic designers and computer programmers. And the content is determined in this stage. The development is the actual creation or production of the content and the learning materials based on the design phase. So for instance, for lack of a better example, this would be where you're developing your PowerPoints and your handouts and really thinking about describing assignments and things like that. The implementation phase is certainly, of course, putting the plan into action and teaching the class. It's that procedure for training. It's a procedure for training the learners, but it also, if you're talking about multiple trainers, then kind of train the trainer phase would be included here too. Materials are delivered and distributed to the group, and this, when we're talking about, okay, they have their book assignment, they have their PowerPoints, things like that. After delivery of the content, the effectiveness of the materials is certainly always evaluated. And during the evaluation phase, I'll use these terms repeatedly, and that is formative, summative. Formative evaluation is along the way, and so it's in essence stop points where you're evaluating the learning, and in many ways you're also evaluating the teaching, and that is, am I getting across what I need to get across? Are we being effective in moving toward that learning outcome? So that's formative evaluation. Summative evaluation is at the end, whether it's at the end of a module, at the end of a course, something like that. So summative evaluation, this is really where your grades come from, right? Formative evaluation is not a graded process. It is formative. You're helping them formulate, right? Moving toward that particular objective. Summative evaluations are where grades come from. And then, obviously, anywhere along this phase, revision is made. This is just another really nice summary table that I found and wanted to share. I find so many things that I want to share. And so, again, it's the same thing. It's looking at the phases and then what happens in these particular phases. This is another approach, and I told you that I was going to share several models with you. This is called the Dick and Carey Systems Approach Model, and it's a little different. It's not quite as linear in many ways as the ADDIE model is, and you see at the very beginning that you're going to identify your goals, and you identify their entry behaviors, and you do an instructional analysis to then write objectives, develop tests, instructional strategies, develop and select materials like a textbook, for instance, develop and conduct an informative evaluation, and then summative evaluation. So, and by the way, informative evaluation, I know that would be formative evaluation. It's just the term they use is informative because it's informing decision making. And then again, we're back to identify entry behaviors, revise, and adapt. So that's the Dick and Carey model. And I'll ask you to consider as we go through here, which ones really work for you. Because I think that we all think about these things in a different way. And so I usually ask the question, which of these is consistent with your cognitive processes? Which ones really work for you? The next model is the Kemp instructional design model, and it's certainly not linear, is it? But what you see here is you see project management, formative evaluation, and all the various and sundry stages or steps that we go through to design a course. So learner characteristics, task analysis, instructional objectives, content sequencing, instructional strategies, designing the message, delivery of the instructional design or the instruction, and then evaluation. And then, of course, you see on the outside is your summative evaluation again. This is another one. This is called the Instructional System Design Concept Map. I don't know if it's really a model, but certainly this was done by Don Clark. Or this is, as we look at this particular concept map. So it's showing at the top a needs analysis, is training the answer. For all of you that are in a professional development setting, that is such an important question, because from years of being a CNS, anything that was wrong, the idea was to throw education at it. And many times it's not a learning need, it's really a behavioral problem, right? And that is, we're not going to solve this problem by teaching. They already know, they're just not doing what they know to do. And so then it's really a performance or behavioral issue. And so I like that decision point there, where it says, no, this is really not a training, not a training issue. It's a behavioral issue. If it is a training issue, then you see down below, you do see ADDIE, right? You see that? And that is, you have analysis, design, develop, implement, and evaluate. So ADDIE is on the left-hand side there. That's your ID model. And then on the other side, what you have is the learning environment. And these are different components that we use. Reflecting, wisdom. Reflecting leads to wisdom. If we start at the bottom, we have absorbing, gives you knowledge. Doing gives you skills. Interacting gives you depth and insight. And reflecting gives you wisdom. And then the end result, of course, is performance. So I don't think that the left side of this particular concept map is unique by any means. It's ADDIE. But I do really like that right-hand side when you're looking at the impact of the learning environment and then, what we're expecting as a result of these different processes. Now, I mentioned Gagne's 9 steps of instruction before, and this I thought was a really kind of interesting little diagram that further shows you what those 9 steps are. So to gain attention, that's the hey you, where you're creating that sense of urgency within the learner. And then you inform the learner of the objective. This is what we're going to do today. And you can see if you're, again, in a professional development setting, how important that would be when you're working with a new graduate or a nurse who maybe isn't a new graduate but new to your unit. So inform the learner of the objective. Then stimulate recall of prior information. Yesterday we learned how to, or remember that, right? And then present the information. And then guidance. Elicit performance. Now you try it. Provide feedback. You did well with this. You didn't do so well with this. You could do this better. And then assess the performance. That's your testing. And then finally, this is the last step, is enhance retention and transfer, remember. And that would be integrated into their work performance. So I think we talked about this a bit in your first nurse educator course, but certainly you'll be seeing this over and over again. So let's talk a little bit about instructional design tables. You're going to do an instructional design table for the presentation that you're going to do to your peers in your live seminar sessions. And this is the way I do an instructional design table. So for me, especially when I'm doing online education, you say, well, what is the week? What is the date of that particular session or that week's module per se. Or you could say, well, what day is that class? This is a Monday, Wednesday class. On Monday, we will do this. On Wednesday, we will do this. What are the objectives for this session? What is the content? What are the learning activities? How are we going to get to achievement of those objectives? And then finally, how are we going to evaluate the learning? And I put all this in a table. I actually put, for instance, this entire course is in a table very much like this that I can give to our instructional designers, or actually well, I'm trying to remember what they're called. And that is that certainly we have IT people who take my translation of this course and put it on 2GU for us. So you'll be developing design tables like this. One interesting question as you look at content versus objectives. A lot of times people will say, well, which do I determine first? Do I do the objectives or do I do the content? And my personal feeling is I do objectives first. And that is I say, what do I want them to achieve by the end of this particular session? And then what content do I need to get in there? But some people do start with the content and then, they develop the objectives. I can tell you that the National League for Nursing has kind of come out to say, we as nurse educators should not be so content driven. We got to get this in, we got to get this in. What we really want are people who can do critical thinking and be able to approach a novel situation and figure out what to do. These are parts of a learning objective, and this particular illustration came from Billings. And typically when you see a completely written learning objective, it is like this. The antecedent is by the end of this session, like, when, who is the learner, the nursing student, what behavior, the content, where, and criteria. So for instance, a nicely written learning objective would be, at the end of this session, the nursing student will demonstrate sterile gloving in the clinical setting 100% of the time. And you'll work on writing your objectives. Remember, they must be evaluatable, right? I have to be able to look at this objective and say, how am I going to be able to evaluate this? And that's why you avoid verbs like know, right? How do you know I know? So let's talk about Bloom's taxonomy. Many of you have heard so much about Bloom's taxonomy over the years. And that is that when we're writing objectives, most of us have a wheel or some listing of these verbs that help us write objectives. So in 1956, when Bloom's taxonomy started, you have the left side of this slide, and it was knowledge, comprehension, application, analysis, synthesis, and evaluation. In 2001, it was revised, and you'll notice that really synthesis became creation, and evaluation actually moved down a step. So that when we talk about people actually creating a work product, in essence, then that's at the pinnacle here. So remember replaces knowledge, understand replaces comprehension, apply, analyze, evaluate, and create. And also, you'll notice that these went from noun forms to verb forms in that last change. So these next few slides are actually from Billings, and I just want to show you the 3 domains and how they, go up. And obviously, when you look at Bloom's taxonomy, we typically think about the cognitive domain most of all. And so what you have here is remembering, understanding, applying, analyzing, evaluating, and then finally creating. And that's our cognitive domain. I personally love this Bloom's wheel. It's one I use quite often. And that is, if you notice in the very center, you have your levels of Bloom's. And then as you move out, you have verbs. And then finally, at the very outer ring, you have work product. right? You have, in essence, what that student's going to do to show you that they have achieved that objective. And so when we talk about evaluation, keep in mind that that outer ring is actually a work product that you would expect to show mastery of that particular objective. Psychomotor domain goes from imitating, manipulating, precision, being able to articulate, and then finally, naturalization means second nature, right? Don't have to think about it, just doing it because it's naturalized. I always think about in the Olympics, they often talk about muscle memory, and that is that the athlete's muscles just know what to do to, pole vault or whatever. Affective domain, wow, it's tough. Affective domain is something that we need to work more and more on, and I'm hopeful we'll have some good discussions about how do we work on this affective domain. The affective domain is related to knowledge from an emotional or feeling perspective. So what we have is receiving, responding, valuing, conceptualizing and organizing, and then finally internalizing that value system or internalizing that concept. And then finally, some other examples of action words. And I apologize for overwhelming you with lots of these different Bloom's things, but this is one that is in Billings, and I really do like it because, again, it has those cognitive domains, all three. Like I said, usually when you look at a Bloom's wheel, for instance, you really only get the cognitive domain. And so what you have here are verbs then to relate to psychomotor as well as affective domains when you're looking at, when you're writing objectives. A lot of these, I will advocate that, you have them blown up and on your bulletin board because you will pull them over and over again. I know I certainly do. So a lot of times these days you have people who are writing outcomes versus objective. And a lot of times when we're doing college courses, for instance, that's what we want our learner outcomes. And that is that at the end of this particular course or at the end of this particular curriculum, so you may very well have baccalaureate outcomes or competencies at the very end of the program. And how do those differ from objectives? Objectives, that's something that one's efforts or actions are intended to attain or accomplish. It's a purpose, it's a goal, it's a target. Whereas an outcome is more of a final product or an end result, a consequence. And so many times you will have objectives for a class and outcomes for a course, although more and more we're being asked to write learner outcomes or learner competencies. So all I can say is that they're very similar in many ways in the way that they're written, and it depends on what you're being asked for by your curriculum council or the university council. Are they using outcomes or objectives? I know that in one university where we recently made that change where I used to work, it was basically at the end of this course, what are 2 or 3 things that you want the student to be able to walk away from this course with and will remember 10 years from now? That's what we're looking for when we're really looking at a course outcome. So the next stage is learning activities. And we're going to spend multiple sessions talking about teaching learning activities. And I just wrote a few things here to make you remember that we really want them to be active learning strategies and that we've moved from teaching to learning. And that is, you as a teacher are more of a facilitator of learning than you are a teacher. And so they should be active if at all possible. We're going to talk more about that. We really want the activity to match the objectives. And that is that this activity will actually help to achieve that objective. We want some fun. We want learners to enjoy what they're doing and to have a sense of achievement. I firmly believe in variety. Can you imagine anything more terrible than coming into class every week and listening to somebody talk and go through a PowerPoint. It should be interesting. And the other thing that to be perfectly honest, and I know you will agree with me on this, that I struggle with, is a reasonable workload. And that is, remember when we talk about college courses, the typical formula is that for every credit hour, you expect that student to spend at least 3 hours outside of the classroom working on that particular course. Since in our classes, when we talk about online classes, we don't really spend 3 hours in class. We do spend 2 hours in our sync sessions though. And so a lot of the learning that you're doing is really outside the classroom, outside of Adobe. And when you're in your live seminar, you're actually focusing on amplifying what you learned in the learning activities that were on the web for you, or on 2GU, I should say, for you. So I love this little illustration. I've never seen this before, and I was just searching for images, and I do really love this. I know that you all have heard this thing about, we remember 10% of what we read, and 20% of what we hear, and 30% of what we see, 50% of what we hear and see, 70% of what we say and write, and 90% of what we do. And I think it's really important to get students to do something that they learn almost immediately, because it helps to really consolidate that learning. I know for me, a lot of times taking notes is really important. When I'm reading or I'm in a presentation, taking notes, even if it's on the handout, writing it helps me to remember it. So on the other side, notice that you're looking at, again, verbs that relate to objectives. Excuse me. So when you look at the very top and you say read and hear, then those are the objectives like define, describe, list, explain, and then demonstrate, apply, practice, and then analyze, define, create, and evaluate. So at the bottom of this pyramid, you see those really high-level objectives that we expect to see with students who are getting into their final year, their baccalaureate program, master's students, and so on. Remember that these high-level objectives, typically, you're going to be using those at the end of a course or at the end of a curriculum. So, for instance, you wouldn't start a class with design and perform a presentation on something. You would start the class with talking about a particular concept or principle, and then building upon it. And then as far as methods of evaluation, I'm going to say the same thing I said about teaching learning strategies, and that is variety. I personally do not believe in courses where the only evaluation method is are multiple exams. I think that there are too many students who perform poorly on exams. I know they need to know how to take exams. I know they have NCLEX coming up and so on. But I don't think the entire grade should be dependent upon exams. We can talk about that. Writing assignments. Unfortunately, in undergraduate programs, a lot of teachers do not use writing assignments because they are labor intensive for the teacher. However, educated people need to know how to write. And the only way you learn how to write is by writing. And the only way you get better at your writing is by receiving feedback about your writing. I'm a firm believer in writing assignments, even for undergraduates. Certainly at their junior and senior level, they should be getting some writing assignments. Doing presentations. Again, educated people know how to speak. And so the more they speak, the better they'll get at it. So doing presentations is very helpful. Plus the fact that they're sharing with their classmates. Obviously, psychomotor skills, there needs to be a demonstration process. And then we'll be talking a whole lot more about evaluation in another module. But certainly looking at your methods of evaluation, and do they match your objectives? Okay? If you have an objective that is identify, describe, you can test that on a multiple choice exam. If the objective is something like develop, compose, present. Obviously, those are not going to be able to be tested by a multiple choice exam. And we'll talk about how important it is that your objectives and your evaluation methods actually match. So that concludes our discussion of instructional design for now. We will certainly have a lot more about it in the live seminars. And like I said, I think this is probably my favorite topic of this entire course because it is so integral to what we all do. And that is whether you're an academic educator or you're an educator in a professional development setting, instructional design is crucially important. Thank you.